They wore masks for years. I'm the one who brought them a mirror. I'm Logan Hayes, 34 years old, married to what I thought was the love of my life, and somehow still treated like the backup plan who never got promoted to starter. You'd think being married would earn you some basic priority in your wife's life. Maybe first consideration when she's making decisions that affect both of you. But apparently, I missed that memo somewhere between saying, "I do," and watching her scroll through her ex-boyfriend's Instagram at our kitchen table. My wife Ashley comes from what I can only describe as a family of professional spectators. The kind of people who watch other people's lives like reality TV and offer commentary nobody asked for. Every family gathering feels like being judged by a panel of critics who peaked in high school but somehow never got the notification that the show ended 20 years ago. Her mother, Margaret, runs the social committee of their little suburban kingdom. Think of someone who could weaponize a casserole recipe and deploy guilt trips with military precision. She doesn't just host gatherings, she orchestrates them like psychological warfare disguised as hospitality. Matching napkins that cost more than my work boots, wine that requires a sommelier's degree to appreciate, and this expression on her face that screams, "I can smell your inadequacy from the driveway." Margaret has this way of asking about my job that makes it sound like community service. "How's the building going, Logan?" she'll ask, like I'm assembling Lincoln logs for therapy. When I try to explain that I manage multi-million-dollar commercial developments, her eyes glaze over faster than a donut shop window. Construction, in her world, means the guy who fixed her leaky sink last Tuesday. Then there's Charles, the father, retired middle management, who treats every conversation like a performance review from 1987. Golf is his religion, quarterly projections are his scripture, and mediocrity is his greatest fear. Every interaction circles back to advancement and achievement, like he's still climbing some invisible corporate ladder that exists only in his mind and lives rent-free in his conversations. Charles has this theory that success can be measured by how often your name appears in the business section of the newspaper. Since my work involves actually building things instead of talking about building things, I apparently don't qualify for his definition of professional accomplishment. The irony is that half the buildings he drives past on his way to the golf course exist because of projects I've managed. But try explaining that to someone who thinks construction means pointing at blueprints while other people do the work. Me? I'm the guy who builds things while they talk about building things. I manage construction projects for Coastal Development Group, the kind of developments that actually change skylines and create jobs. Not the Facebook posts about changing skylines or the LinkedIn articles about disrupting the construction industry. Actual concrete, steel, and glass structures that people live and work in for decades. I work on real developments, commercial office buildings, residential complexes, mixed-use projects that require coordinating with city planners, architects, environmental engineers, and about 50 different contractor specializations. Last year alone, I wrapped up a $23 million medical complex that's already being featured in architectural magazines. And I'm currently managing a waterfront development that's going to transform an entire district of the city. But try explaining project management to people who think construction means wearing a hard hat for photo opportunities. They hear construction and picture someone swinging a hammer, not someone coordinating environmental impact studies, zoning approvals, contractor bidding processes, and inspection schedules that would make a NASA launch look simple. Ashley's caught between two worlds, and I used to think that made her diplomatic. She loves me, at least I thought she did, but she also craves her family's approval, like it's oxygen. So, when her ex-boyfriend Ryan started sliding back into her life through social media 6 months ago, presenting himself as this struggling entrepreneur who needed emotional support, she bought his story completely. Ryan Cooper. Even his name sounds like it came from a catalog of generic white guys who peaked in college fraternity leadership positions. We'd met him briefly at a mutual friend's wedding 3 years ago, back when Ashley and I were still in the honeymoon phase of our marriage. He spent the entire reception talking about his real estate empire and game-changing developments to anyone who would listen, which basically meant cornering people at the bar until they found excuses to refill their drinks. I remember thinking at the time that he talked a lot about vision and strategy without mentioning any actual buildings or projects. Classic case of big mouth, small receipts. But Ashley had dated him for 2 years in college, back when his confidence seemed charming instead of compensatory, And she still carried some nostalgic soft spot for the guy he used to be, before reality taught him that dreams require work. The thing about Ashley is, she's always been a sucker for redemption stories, especially when they involve someone from her past who used to matter to her. She sees potential in people even when the evidence suggests they've already reached their ceiling. It's one of the qualities I fell in love with, watching her believe in people's better angels even when those angels had been on permanent vacation for years. So when Ryan started sliding into her DMs with sob stories about cash flow problems and investor backing falling through, she responded exactly the way he knew she would. Poor guy just needed moral support and someone who understood his vision. Translation: he needed attention and validation from my wife because his current life wasn't providing enough of either. "Logan, you don't understand," she'd say, scrolling through his Instagram posts while I tried to eat breakfast. "He's going through a really tough time with his business. All his investors pulled out, and he's struggling to keep his development projects alive. He just needs someone to believe in him." Right. Because nothing says struggling entrepreneur like daily posts from expensive restaurants, luxury car dealerships, and vacation spots that require passport stamps. But Ashley has always been selective about which details she notices when she wants to help someone. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago, and I can remember the exact moment because it crystallized everything I'd been trying not to see about our marriage for months. Ashley and I were having dinner when she put down her fork and looked at me with that expression women get when they're about to rearrange your entire life without consulting you. The kind of look that says, "I've been thinking," and guarantees that whatever comes next will involve sacrifices you didn't know you'd signed up for. "Logan, I think we should take a break from the romantic stuff for a while," she said, like she was suggesting we switch cable providers or try a different grocery store. "Ryan really needs me right now, and I think focusing on friendship and emotional support is more important than, physical intimacy and couple time." I stared at her across our kitchen table, the same table where we'd planned our wedding, discussed buying a house, and mapped out what we thought was our future together. Now she was using it to announce that our marriage was being put on temporary hold so she could provide therapeutic services to her ex-boyfriend. "You want to put our marriage on pause so you can emotionally babysit your ex-boyfriend?" I asked, setting down my own fork because suddenly the idea of eating seemed impossible. "It's not like that," she said quickly, and I could hear the defensiveness creeping into her voice. "It's just, he's at such a vulnerable place right now, and I feel like I'm the only person who really believes in his potential. Sometimes friendship and support are more valuable than romance, especially when someone's dreams are on the line." Let me tell you something about that moment. It's the kind of conversation that crystallizes everything you've been trying not to see about your relationship for months. The moment when you realize you're not the main character in your own marriage, you're the supporting actor who provides stability and pays the bills while she chases drama with someone else who used to matter. "So, let me understand this," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice level because the alternative was saying things that couldn't be unsaid. "You want to be just friends with your husband so you can provide unpaid emotional labor to the guy who used to sleep with you because his imaginary business empire needs cheerleading more than our actual marriage needs attention." She flinched like I'd slapped her. "You're making it sound worse than it is, Logan. You're being possessive and insecure." Possessive, right. Because expecting your wife to prioritize your marriage over her ex-boyfriend's feelings is apparently toxic masculinity in 2023. Because asking for basic consideration in your own relationship now qualifies as emotional abuse. "Am I being possessive?" I said, "or am I just noticing that you're choosing him over me and calling it friendship? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're demoting your husband to make room for your ex-boyfriend's emotional needs. That's not fair. You have a stable career. You're confident in yourself. Ryan's struggling, and he needs someone who believes in his vision. You don't understand what it's like to have your dreams falling apart." Actually, I understood exactly what it was like to have dreams falling apart. I was watching it happen in real time, as my wife explained why another man's feelings were more important than our marriage vows. But here's the thing about construction work. It teaches you patience and strategy. You don't tear down a building with a sledgehammer and hope for the best. You study the structure, identify the weak points, and apply pressure precisely where it will do the most damage. Sometimes the best response to betrayal isn't anger. It's careful observation and strategic planning. So I smiled and said, You know what, Ashley? You're absolutely right. Take all the time you need to help Ryan figure out his life. I'll be here when you're done playing therapist to entrepreneurs who need pep talks more than business plans. She looked relieved, which should have been my first warning sign that this wasn't a temporary arrangement in her mind. This was a trial separation disguised as emotional charity, and she'd been planning it longer than she was admitting. "Thank you for understanding," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand, like we'd just negotiated a business deal instead of essentially pausing our marriage. "I really think this will help all of us figure out what we actually want." What we actually want. As if I hadn't been clear about wanting to be married to someone who considered me her first priority instead of her backup plan. For the next 3 weeks, I watched my wife transform into Ryan's personal life coach and emotional support system. She'd text him throughout the day, sending encouragement and business advice for a business that, as far as I could tell, existed mainly in his Instagram bio. She'd stay up late on video calls, listening to his problems and validating his entrepreneurial dreams, while our conversations became logistics meetings about groceries and utility payments. The irony wasn't lost on me. While she was busy providing free consulting services for his imaginary real estate empire, I was actually managing the construction of a 15-story waterfront development that would house 300 families and employ dozens of contractors for the next 8 months. But emotional support for fantasy always gets more attention than respect for reality. Ashley would come to bed after these marathon counseling sessions with Ryan, and I'd pretend to be asleep while she'd talk about his breakthrough moments and creative solutions. She'd gotten so invested in his success story that she'd started referring to his ideas like they were joint ventures. Ryan thinks the key to real estate development is understanding the emotional connection people have with spaces, she told me one morning while making coffee. He's developing this whole philosophy about architecture and human psychology. I almost choked on my cereal. Philosophy about architecture. From a guy who'd never actually built anything more complex than a LinkedIn profile. Meanwhile, I was dealing with actual architectural challenges, coordinating with environmental engineers about waterfront construction regulations, managing soil stability assessments for high-rise foundations, and navigating city planning meetings where real developers make decisions that affect real people's lives. But apparently that was just stable career work, not visionary entrepreneurship worthy of emotional investment. Then came the invitation that would change everything. The invitation to her family's 4th of July BBQ came with the kind of casual manipulation that Margaret had perfected over decades of suburban social warfare. "Annual tradition, mandatory attendance," Ashley announced, reading the text message. "And Mom suggested I invite Ryan because he doesn't have anywhere else to go for the holiday and could really use some family time." Family time. Because nothing says family bonding like inviting your wife's ex-boyfriend to a patriotic celebration while your actual husband stands there holding the potato salad. I agreed to the invitation, not because I was feeling generous, but because by then I'd done some research into Ryan's actual professional situation, and I was curious to see exactly how far he'd take his performance in front of an audience. 3 weeks of watching Ashley invest her emotional energy into his business, fantasies had given me plenty of time to investigate what his real estate empire actually consisted of. The beauty of construction project management is that you develop relationships with people across the entire development industry. Architects, contractors, real estate agents, city planners, zoning commissioners. We all work together on projects, and we all talk to each other. It's a small community where actual professionals recognize each other and wannabes stick out like traffic cones at a black-tie dinner. A few phone calls to colleagues in residential sales had confirmed what I'd already suspected. Ryan. Cooper was listed as a junior sales agent with Harbor Realty, a mid-tier firm that specializes in pre-construction condo sales. His total sales volume for the past year was exactly 3 units, generating roughly $12,000 in commission. Not exactly the kind of numbers that support Instagram posts from high-end restaurants and luxury car showrooms. But the real revelation came when I started asking about specific development projects in the waterfront district, where Ryan claimed to be breaking ground. Turns out there was indeed a major luxury development happening in that exact area. The Ocean View Marina Complex, a mixed-use project featuring 15-story residential towers, ground floor retail space, and private marina access. The same project I'd been managing for Coastal Development Group for the past 8 months. The same project that had kept me working 60-hour weeks, coordinating with marine engineers about saltwater corrosion prevention, navigating environmental protection regulations, and managing the kind of complex contractor scheduling that turns normal humans into caffeine-dependent insomniacs. Ryan wasn't developing anything. He'd sold exactly 3 pre-construction units in my project and had somehow convinced himself, and apparently Ashley, that this made him a visionary real estate developer. He was taking credit for work that I was actually doing, claiming ownership of a project that I was building, and using my professional accomplishments to impress my own wife. The audacity was almost artistic in its completeness. Margaret and Charles's house was decorated like a patriotic fever dream when we arrived for the BBQ. Red, white, and blue bunting that looked professionally installed, matching table settings that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and enough American flag imagery to stock a small-town 4th of July parade. Ashley arrived with Ryan in tow, introducing him to the gathered relatives like he was some kind of business celebrity making a guest appearance at a suburban charity event. He looked exactly like I remembered from the wedding 3 years ago. Expensive casual clothes that screamed, "I'm successful but approachable," perfectly styled hair that required more maintenance than most people's lawns, and that smile that somehow managed to be both confident and desperate at the same time. Ryan worked the crowd like a politician at a fundraiser, shaking hands and dispensing business, speak about market opportunities and development strategies. He had this way of standing just a little too close when he talked to people, like proximity could somehow transfer credibility. "Logan, good to see you again, man," he said when he finally made his way over to me, extending his hand like we were old friends reuniting instead of awkward acquaintances forced together by circumstance. "Ashley tells me you're still doing the construction thing. That's solid work. Really admirable stuff." The construction thing. Solid work. Like I was building sandcastles while he was designing the skyline of tomorrow. "Thanks," I said, gripping his hand just enough to remind him that I work with my hands for a living and know exactly how much pressure to apply. "And you're still in real estate development?" His smile widened, and I could practically see the rehearsed pitch loading in his brain. "Actually, things have really taken off lately. Just broke ground on a major waterfront project. Luxury condos, mixed-use commercial space, marina access, the whole 9 yards. It's been a challenge, but that's what separates the visionaries from the workers, you know? Visionaries from the workers." I filed that phrase away for later use, right next to the construction thing in my mental catalog of condescending comments that would require eventual response. The afternoon continued with Ryan holding court on the patio, regaling anyone who would listen with stories about his development empire. He talked about zoning battles he'd never fought, architectural challenges he'd never faced, investor meetings that existed only in his imagination, and construction timelines he'd never managed, using just enough technical language to sound credible to people who'd never actually built anything larger than a backyard deck. Ashley hung on every word, occasionally glancing at me like she was waiting for me to be impressed by her ex-boyfriend's business acumen. Margaret and Charles nodded sagely, clearly thinking Ryan represented the kind of ambitious achiever they'd always hoped their daughter would end up with, instead of the guy who just did solid work in construction. "Tell them about the waterfront project," Ashley prompted during a lull in Ryan's monologue. "The one you're developing down by the marina." This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. Ryan's eyes lit up like someone had just asked him to explain his favorite movie. "Oh, that's my crown jewel," he said, pulling out his phone with the enthusiasm of a parent showing baby photos. 15-story luxury towers, ground floor retail, private marina access with yacht slips. We're talking about transforming the entire waterfront district. It's the kind of project that defines a developer's career. He started swiping through images on his phone, showing architectural renderings and construction site photos to the assembled family members. "This is where we're breaking ground," he said, holding up his screen so everyone could see. "Ocean view units starting at $800,000, penthouse suites going for over $2 million. Pre-sales are already exceeding projections." I recognized those renderings immediately, not because I'd seen them on some real estate website, but because I'd been in the meetings where those exact architectural plans were finalized. Those weren't Ryan's development dreams. They were blueprints for the Ocean View Marina Complex, complete with the specific design. Modifications I'd requested to address wind load calculations and saltwater exposure concerns. The construction site photos he was showing were pictures I'd taken myself during my weekly progress inspections. I could see the foundation work that my crews had completed last month, the steel framework installation that I'd supervised personally, and the crane positioning that I'd coordinated with our structural engineering team. Ryan was literally showing off my work and claiming it as his own empire, using photos from my job site to impress my wife and her family. The environmental challenges alone have been incredible, Ryan continued, clearly enjoying his audience. Marine construction requires specialized expertise in saltwater corrosion prevention, soil stability assessments for high water foundations, and coordination with environmental protection agencies. Most developers don't have the technical background to handle this kind of complexity. Margaret leaned forward, clearly impressed. That sounds incredibly sophisticated. How did you develop that expertise? Years of experience, Ryan said smoothly. You can't just jump into waterfront development. It requires understanding everything from marine engineering principles to environmental impact mitigation. We've had to work with specialized contractors who understand the unique challenges of building in coastal environments. I felt something shift inside me, like tumblers clicking into place in a lock. This wasn't just stolen valor or resume inflation. This was complete identity theft, with a real estate license attached. He was describing the exact challenges I'd spent months solving, using the technical language I'd learned through actual experience, claiming expertise he'd gained by reading the marketing materials for a project he'd barely touched. The specialized contractors he mentioned, I'd hired them. The environmental impact mitigation, I'd coordinated it. The marine engineering principles, I'd spent weeks in meetings with consultants learning exactly how to implement them. That's fascinating, I said casually, setting down my beer and pulling out my own phone. What's the development company called? Ryan's confident expression flickered slightly. Oh, we operate under several LLCs for tax purposes, he said, the verbal equivalent of tap dancing around a direct question. Complex financial structuring across multiple projects. It allows for better investment flexibility and liability protection. Translation. He had no idea what company was actually building it because he wasn't involved in any meaningful capacity whatsoever. Charles nodded approvingly. Smart business practice. Limited liability companies are essential for large-scale real estate development. What's the primary LLC managing this specific project? I watched Ryan's face go through several interesting calculations as he tried to invent a credible answer to a question that had a very specific, very verifiable response. Coastal Development Solutions, he said, after a pause that lasted just long enough to be noticeable. We've got partnerships with several regional firms, so the corporate structure can be pretty complex for outsiders to follow. I opened my email app and scrolled to my work folder, the one I accessed about 50 times per day to coordinate with contractors, architects, and city planners. The same folder that contained contracts, inspection reports, and progress updates for the Ocean View Marina Complex. Interesting, I said, looking up from my phone, because according to these project documents, the Ocean View Marina Complex is being developed by Coastal Development Group, not Coastal Development Solutions, and I'm listed as the senior project manager overseeing the entire construction process. The patio went silent except for the sound of someone's drink hitting the deck. Ryan's face went through a fascinating series of color changes as he stared at my phone screen, where the official project header clearly showed my name and title in bold letters. Ashley blinked rapidly, like someone had just switched on bright lights in a dark room. Margaret and Charles leaned closer, reading the documents that clearly identified me as the actual project manager for the development Ryan had been claiming as his personal empire. Ryan started, then stopped, apparently realizing that any explanation he offered would only make things worse. Oh, wait, I continued, scrolling through more files with the deliberate pace of someone who had all day to make his point. Here's something interesting. The vendor contact list for the project. Ryan Cooper isn't listed anywhere in the development team, but there is a Ryan Cooper in our sales database. I paused, reading directly from my phone. Ryan Cooper, residential sales agent with Harbor Realty. Units sold, 3 condos in the pre-construction phase. Total commission earned, $12,000. Charles whistled low. $12,000? That's quite a difference from developing a $15 million project. Ashley stared at Ryan like she was seeing him clearly for the first time in months. You're a sales agent? You told me you were the developer. I never said I was the primary developer, Ryan backtracked frantically, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning fog. I said I was involved in the development process. Sales is a crucial component of any successful project. Actually, I said, checking my notes with the methodical precision of someone who documented everything. You said, and I quote, "This is my crown jewel. We're breaking ground next month." You also mentioned pre-sales exceeding projections, which is particularly interesting because as the actual project manager, I can confirm that sales have been slower than anticipated due to current market conditions and interest rate fluctuations. Margaret looked at Ryan with the expression she usually reserved for people who brought store-bought desserts to potluck dinners. So, you're not actually developing anything? You're a sales agent who sold 3 apartments? It's more complicated than that, Ryan said weakly, his voice sounding like air leaking from a punctured tire. The sales process is integral to the development cycle. Without successful pre-sales, projects can't move forward to construction phase. No, I said, standing up and putting my phone away because the evidence had spoken for itself. It's actually pretty simple. You're a sales agent who sold 3 condos and decided to play fantasy developer on Instagram. You lied to my wife about being a struggling entrepreneur when you're actually just a guy who makes commission on other people's work and pretends it's your empire. Ashley's face had gone pale, and she was staring at Ryan like someone had just explained that Santa Claus was actually her alcoholic uncle in a costume. Ryan, is this true? Did you lie to me about everything? Ryan looked around the patio like he was searching for an exit that didn't involve walking past me or admitting the obvious. Look, Ashley, I can explain. The real estate industry is complicated, and sometimes the distinctions between different roles aren't as clear-cut as people think. Explain what? Ashley said, her voice rising with the kind of anger that comes from realizing you've been played by someone you trusted. That you made me feel guilty for not supporting your business when you don't actually have a business. That you convinced me to put my marriage on hold so I could provide free therapy sessions for your fake career crisis. Charles cleared his throat, apparently deciding that diplomacy was less important than truth. Son, I think it might be time for you to leave. Ryan nodded quickly, clearly relieved to have an escape route that didn't require him to continue explaining why he'd been claiming credit for a $15 million construction project he'd had nothing to do with except selling 3 units to people with more money than sense. Yeah, I should probably get going, he said, gathering his things with the desperate efficiency of someone fleeing a crime scene. I'll call you later, Ashley. Don't, she said quietly, but with the kind of finality that closes doors permanently. We watched him practically sprint to his car, probably already composing the social media posts that would spin this disaster into some kind of learning experience about toxic family dynamics and unsupportive environments. Margaret broke the silence first, turning to me with something that looked suspiciously like respect and possibly a small amount of shame. Logan, I had no idea you were managing such an important project. Why didn't you ever mention it? I don't usually talk about work at family gatherings, I said, settling back into my chair. Seemed like bragging, and honestly, most people's eyes glaze over when you start explaining construction project management. Charles laughed, actually laughed, the first genuine sound of amusement I'd ever heard from him that wasn't directed at someone else's expense. Maybe you should brag a little more. Managing a $15 million waterfront development is impressive work. Especially considering the technical complexity, Margaret added, clearly trying to make up for 3 years of treating me like I fixed leaky pipes for a living. All that environmental engineering and marine construction expertise, that's quite sophisticated. Ashley hadn't said anything since Ryan left. She just sat there staring at her hands, probably realizing that she'd spent 3 weeks providing emotional support to a fraud, while dismissing her husband's actual professional accomplishments as stable career work. Later that evening, after we'd driven home in the kind of silence that feels like holding your breath underwater, Ashley finally spoke. I'm sorry, she said quietly, the words coming out like they hurt to say. I'm so sorry, Logan. I completely misjudged everything. You didn't misjudge, I said, keeping my eyes on the road, because looking at her would have made this conversation harder than it needed to be. You chose. You chose to believe his stories over supporting your husband. You chose to prioritize his feelings over our marriage. You chose to put our relationship on pause for a guy who was lying to you about everything that mattered. She started crying then, which didn't move me as much as it might have a month ago. Tears are easy to produce. Trust is much harder to rebuild. I don't know why I did that, she said between sobs. I think I got caught up in the idea of supporting someone who needed help, and I forgot that you don't need fixing because you're not broken. You're successful and confident and real, and I threw that away to chase some fantasy about rescuing someone who was never actually in trouble. Right, I said. You wanted to be the hero in someone else's story, instead of appreciating the life we'd already built together. Can you forgive me? She asked, and I could hear the genuine fear in her voice, like she was finally realizing that some damage can't be undone with apologies. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman I'd married who'd temporarily forgotten that solid work builds lasting foundations while fantasy crumbles under the first real pressure. I can forgive you, I said finally, but I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen. You showed me exactly where I rank in your priorities, and that's not something we can just forget with tears and apologies. She nodded, crying harder now. What do we do now? Now you decide if you want to be married to the guy who actually builds things, or if you want to keep chasing stories about guys who just talk about building things, because I'm done competing with fantasies. The next morning, Ashley deleted Ryan's contact information and sent him a message blocking all future communication. She also called her parents to clarify exactly what my job actually involved, and to thank them for finally treating me with the respect I'd earned years ago. Margaret even called personally to apologize for underestimating my career, and to ask if I'd be willing to consult on some renovation work they were considering for their house. Turns out, respect is easier to earn when people realize you're not just swinging a hammer for photo opportunities. 6 months later, the Ocean View Marina Complex had its grand opening. The local newspaper ran a feature article about the development, including a photo of me with the construction team and a detailed explanation of the technical challenges involved in waterfront construction. Ashley framed that article and hung it in our kitchen, next to our wedding photo. My husband, the actual developer, she wrote on social media, posting the newspaper feature with obvious pride. Ryan Cooper still sells real estate somewhere, probably telling new prospects about his vast development experience and vision for transforming waterfront districts. Some lies are too profitable to abandon completely. But he's not my problem anymore. He's just another guy who talks about building things while other people do the actual work. The difference is now, everyone knows which one of us is real. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying someone's lies. It's just turning on the lights so everyone can see clearly. They wore masks for years. I just brought them a mirror.